Sonny, a frail-looking young man with pale skin and dark circles under his eyes, sat on a rusty bench across from the police station. He cradled a cup of coffee in his hands. Not the cheap synthetic type that slum rats like him usually had access to, but the real deal. It was a cup of plant-based coffee, usually available only to higher-ranked citizens, and it had cost most of his savings. But today, Sonny decided to pamper himself. After all, his life was about to end. Enjoying the warmth of the luxurious drink, he raised the cup and savored the aroma. Then, tentatively, he took a small sip and immediately grimaced. "Oh, it's so bitter!" Giving the cup of coffee an intense look, Sonny sighed and forced himself to drink some more. Bitter or not, he was determined to get his money's worth. Taste buds be damned. "I should have bought a piece of real meat instead. Who knew actual coffee is so disgusting? Well, it's going to keep me awake at least." He stared into the distance, dozing off, and then slapped himself in the face to wake up. "Ugh, what a ripoff!" Shaking his head and cursing, Sonny finished the coffee and stood up. Rich people living in this part of the city were rushing past the small park on their way to work, staring at him with strange expressions. Looking haggard in his cheap clothes, eyes heavy and bagged from lack of sleep, pallid skin, his frame unhealthily thin, Sonny was indeed out of place here. He tossed the cup into a garbage bin. The cup missed the bin by a wide margin and fell on the ground. Sonny rolled his eyes in exasperation, walked over, and picked it up before carefully putting it in the trash. Then, with a slight grin, he crossed the street and entered the police station. Inside, a tired-looking officer gave him a quick glance and frowned with obvious distaste. "Are you lost, boy?" Sonny looked around with curiosity, noting reinforced armor plates on the walls and poorly hidden turret nests in the ceiling. The officer, too, looked scruffy and mean. At least police stations remain the same wherever you go. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Sonny cleared his throat. No, I'm not lost at all." Then he scratched the back of his head and added, "As demanded by the third special directive, I am here to surrender myself as a carrier of the nightmare spell." The officer's expression instantly changed from irritated to wary. He looked the young man over once again, this time with piercing intensity. "Are you sure you're infected? When did you start showing symptoms?" Sonny shrugged. "A week ago?" The officer became visibly paler. "Shit." Then, with a hurried motion, he pressed a button on his terminal and bellowed, "Attention! Code black in the lobby. I repeat, code black." The nightmare spell first appeared in the world a few decades ago. Back then, the planet was just starting to recover from a series of devastating natural disasters and subsequent resource wars. At first, the emergence of a new disease that caused millions of people to complain about constant fatigue and sleepiness did not attract a lot of attention. But when they started to fall into an unnatural slumber with no sign of waking up even days later, governments finally panicked. Of course, by then, it was already too late. Not that an early response could have made any difference. When the infected started dying in their sleep, their dead bodies turning into monsters, no one was ready. Nightmare creatures quickly overwhelmed national militaries, plunging the world into complete chaos. No one knew what the spell was, what powers it possessed, and how to fight it. In the end, it was the awakened, those who survived the first trials of the spell and came back alive, who put a stop to its rampage. Armed with miraculous abilities earned in their nightmares, they restored peace and created a semblance of a new order. Of course, it was only the first of the catastrophes brought upon by the spell, but as far as Sonny was concerned, none of it had anything to do with him. Not until a few days ago, that is, when he first started having trouble staying awake. For an average person, being chosen by the spell was as much of a risk as an opportunity. Kids learned survival skills and fighting techniques in school on the off chance of being infected. Well-to-do families hired private tutors to train their children in all sorts of martial arts. Those from the awakened clans even had access to powerful legacies, wielding inherited memories and echoes in their first visit to the dream realm. The richer your family was, the better your chances of surviving and becoming an awakened were. But for Sonny, who had no family to speak of and spent most of his time scrounging for food instead of going to school, being chosen by the spell presented no opportunity at all. To him, it was basically a death sentence. A few minutes later, Sonny was yawning while several policemen were busy putting him in restraints. Soon he was fastened into a bulky chair that looked like a weird mix between a hospital bed and a torture device. The room they were in was situated in the basement of the police station, with thick armored walls and a formidable-looking vault door. Other officers were standing near the walls with automatic rifles in their hands and grim expressions on their faces. Sonny did not particularly care about them. The only thing he could think about was how much he wanted to sleep. Finally, the vault door opened, and a gray-haired policeman walked in. He had a seasoned face and stern eyes, looking like someone who had seen a lot of terrible things in his life. After checking the restraints, the policeman glanced quickly on his wristwatch and then turned to Sonny. "What's your name, kid?" Sonny blinked a few times trying to concentrate, then shifted uncomfortably. "Sonny." The old policeman raised an eyebrow. "Sonny. Strange name." Sonny tried to shrug but found himself unable to move. "Some of my friends call me Sunless, since I can seem quite unhappy from time to time. And at least I have a name. Back in the outskirts, not everyone gets one." After another yawn, he added, "It's because I was born during a solar eclipse. My mom had a poetic soul, you see. That's why he got this weird-ass name. And his little sister was called Rain, back when she still lived with them at least. Whether it was the result of poetic imagination or simple laziness, he didn't know." The policeman grunted. Do you want me to contact your family?" Sonny simply shook his head. "There's no one. Don't bother." For a second, there was a dark look on the policeman's face. Then his expression turned serious. "All right, Sonny. How long can you stay awake?" Not long." The policeman sighed. "Then we don't have time for the full procedure. Try to resist for as long as you can and listen to me very carefully, okay?" Not waiting for a response, he added, "How much do you know about the nightmare spell?" Sonny gave him a questioning look. "As much as anyone, I guess. Who doesn't know about the spell?" "Not the fancy stuff you see in dramas and hear in the propaganda broadcasts. I mean, how much do you really know?" That was a hard question to answer. "Don't I just go into the dream realm, kill a few monsters to complete the first nightmare, receive magic powers, and become an awakened?" The old policeman shook his head. "Listen carefully. Once you fall asleep, you'll be transported into your first nightmare. The nightmares are sort of like trials, challenges created by the spell. Once inside, you'll meet monsters, horrible creatures who will test you, fight you, try their damnedest to break you. But you'll also meet people. They aren't worth trusting either. Your best bet is to fight for yourself. Remember, they are not real. They're just illusions conjured up to test you." "How do you know?" The policeman just stared at him. "I mean, no one understands what the spell is and how it works, right? So, how do you know that they're not real?" "You might have to kill them, kid. So, do yourself a favor and just think about them as illusions." "Oh." The old policeman waited for a second, then nodded and continued. "A lot of things about the first nightmare depend on luck. Generally, it shouldn't be overwhelmingly hard. The situation you're in, the tools you have at your disposal, and the creatures you have to defeat should be within the range of your abilities, at least. After all, the spell sets up trials, not executions. You're a bit disadvantaged due to, your circumstances. But kids from the outskirts are tough. Don't give up on yourself." Uh-huh. Sonny was getting more and more sleepy. It was becoming hard to follow the conversation. "About those magic powers you mentioned. You will indeed receive them if you survive until the end of the nightmare. What those powers will be exactly depends on your natural affinity as well as what you do during the trial. But some of it will be at your disposal right from the start. The voice of the old policeman sounded more and more distant. Sonny's eyelids were so heavy that he was struggling to keep his eyes open. Remember, the first thing you must do once inside the nightmare is to check your attributes and your aspect. If you get a combat-oriented aspect, something like a swordsman or an archer, things will be easier. If it is reinforced by a physical attribute, then that's even better. Combat aspects are the most common, so the probability of receiving one is high. The armored room was growing dimmer. If you're unlucky, and your aspect has nothing to do with combat, don't despair. Sorcery and utility aspects are useful in their own ways. You'll just have to be smart about it. There are really no useless aspects. Well, almost. So just do anything in your power to survive. If you survive, you'll be halfway to becoming an awakened. But if you die, you'll open a gate for a nightmare creature to appear in the real world. Which means that my colleagues and I will have to deal with it, so please, don't die sunless. Already half asleep, Sonny felt a bit touched by the policeman's words. Or at least try not to die right away. The nearest awakened won't be able to get here for a few hours, so we would really appreciate it if you don't make us fight that thing ourselves. What? With that last thought, Sonny finally slipped into a deep slumber. Everything became black, and then, in the darkness, a faintly familiar voice rang.
Aspirant, welcome to the nightmare spell. Prepare for your first trial.
Sonny dreamt of a mountain, jagged and lonesome. It dwarfed other peaks of the mountain chain, cutting the night sky with its sharp edges. A radiant moon bathed its slopes in the ghostly pale light. On one of the slopes, the remnants of an old road stubbornly clung to the rocks. Here and there, paved stones could be seen through the snow. They were worn and showed signs of weathering. A sheer cliff face formed an impregnable wall to the right side of the road. On the left, a silent black sea of nothingness indicated an endless fall. Strong winds crashed into the mountain over and over again, screaming in powerless rage. Suddenly, the moon fell over the horizon. The sun rose from the west, streaked across the sky, and disappeared in the east. Snowflakes jumped from the ground and returned to the embrace of the clouds. Sonny realized that he was seeing the flow of time in reverse. In an instant, hundreds of years flew by. The snow retreated, bearing the old road. Cold shivers ran down Sonny's back as he noticed human bones littering the ground. A moment later, the bones were gone, and in their place, a slave caravan appeared. Moving backward down the mountain, the clamoring of chains echoed hauntingly through the peak. Time slowed, stopped, and then resumed its usual pace. A loud voice boomed in Sonny's ears.
Aspirant, welcome to the nightmare spell. Prepare for your first trial.
Sonny searched around for the source of the voice, but saw nothing. What the hell was that? With nothing and no one to guide him, Sonny began to walk along the snowy mountain path. Step, step, another step. A dull ache was radiating through Sonny's bleeding feet as he was shivering from the cold. His threadbare tunic was nearly useless against the biting wind. There was a sudden jolt of pain from his wrists. Sonny looked down to see that he was now wearing iron shackles. The frozen metal rubbed on his raw and broken skin, sending sharp pangs of pain with his every step. No, I can't be part of the caravan. This isn't what the dream realm is supposed to be like. Sonny looked up and down, noticing a long chain winding up the road, with dozens and dozens of hollow-eyed people, slaves, just like him, shackled to it at small intervals. A man with broad shoulders and a bloodied back walked with a measured gait ahead of him. Behind him, a shifty-looking guy with quick, desperate eyes quietly cursed under his breath in a language that Sonny did not know but somehow understood. From time to time, armed horsemen in ancient-style armor would pass by, giving the slaves menacing looks. Sonny expected the first nightmare to be bad, but this wasn't like anything he anticipated. He was more bewildered than panicked. Usually, freshly chosen aspirants would find themselves in a scenario that presented them with a fair amount of agency. They would become members of privileged or warrior castes, with plenty of access to necessary weapons to at least try to tackle any conflict. Starting as a powerless slave, shackled and already half dead, was as far from being ideal as one could imagine. However, the spell was as much about challenge as it was about balance. As the old policeman said, it created trials, not executions. So Sonny was pretty sure that to counter this abysmal start, it would reward him with something good, a powerful aspect at least. Let's see, how do I do this? Remembering popular webtoons he read as a child, Sonny concentrated and thought about words like status, myself, and information. Indeed, as soon as he focused, shimmering runes appeared in the air in front of him. Once again, although he did not know this ancient alphabet, the meaning behind it was somehow clear. His eyes flitted over his bleak profile, which read, Name, sunless. True name, none. Soul rank, dormant. Memories, none. Echoes, none. Attributes, fated. Mark of divinity, child of shadows. Aspect, temple slave. Sonny wasn't surprised to have the lowest possible soul rank. This was his first nightmare. He had hoped he might be gifted a memory or an echo. Memories were magical items that could be obtained from the dream realm and summoned by the dreamer. Similarly, echoes were creatures the dreamer could call on for aid, but it seemed the nightmare spell didn't see fit to grant Sonny any resources. Sonny knew he couldn't focus on what he hadn't been granted. Life had taught him that a long time ago. He remembered the cop's advice and focused on his aspect. Temple slave. Didn't sound promising, but he dug deeper, pulling up the aspect description. The runes read, Aspect description. Slave is a useless wretch with no skills or abilities worthy of mention. A temple slave is just the same, except much rarer. At this point, Sonny finally lost his composure. No useless aspects, my ass! This has to be a fucking joke! I was supposed to get a fair shot! Sonny stared at the runes, trying to convince himself that he may be seeing things. Surely he couldn't be that unlucky, right? Preoccupied by his thoughts, he lost the rhythm of his steps and stumbled, pulling the chain down with his weight. Immediately, the shifty guy behind him screamed, Yeah, I'm shifty, see? Whores bastard, watch where you're going! Sonny hurriedly dismissed the runes, which were only visible to him, and tried to recover his balance. A moment later, he was once again walking steadily. However, not before inadvertently pulling on the chain one more time. The man behind him snarled, You little shit, I'm gonna kill you. The broad-shouldered man in front of Sonny chuckled without turning his head.
Why bother? The weakling will be dead by sunrise anyway. The mountain will kill him. It'll kill you and me too, just a bit later. I don't know what the Imperials are thinking, forcing us into this cold.
The shifty guy gasped. Speak for yourself, fool. I'm planning to survive. Sonny silently shook his head and concentrated on not falling again. What a charming pair. Suddenly, a third voice joined the conversation from somewhere further back. This one sounded gentle and intelligent. This mountain pass is usually much warmer this time of year. We just had really bad luck. Also, I would advise you against harming this boy. The Weasley man sounded annoyed.
Why's that?
Sonny turned his head slightly. He still couldn't catch sight of the mysterious stranger, but he caught their answer. Haven't you seen the markings on his skin? He is not like us, who fell into slavery due to debts, crimes, or misfortune. He was born a slave. A temple slave, to be precise. Not long ago, the Imperials destroyed the last temple of the Shadow God. I suspect that this is how the boy ended up here. The broad-shouldered man cast a look back.
So what? Why should we be afraid of a half-forgotten weakling god? He couldn't even save his temples.
Despite the other men's attitudes, the third person remained calm. The Empire is protected by the mighty War God. Of course, they're not afraid to burn down a few temples. But we, here, are not protected by anything or anyone. Do you want to risk angering a god? The broad-shouldered man grunted, not willing to answer. Their conversation was stopped by a young soldier riding a beautiful white horse. Clad in a simple leather cuirass, armed with a spear and a short sword, he looked dignified and noble. To Sonny's irritation, the asshole was really pretty, too. If this was a historical drama, the soldier would be a male lead. There was no particular menace in his voice, even something resembling concern. What is going on here? When everyone hesitated, the gentle-voiced slave answered, It is nothing, sir. We are all just tired and cold, especially our young friend over there. This journey is truly too hard for someone that young. The soldier looked at Sonny with pity, and the teen felt resentment bubble up in him. Who was this soldier to look at him like that? He couldn't be that much older. The soldier sighed and took a flask from his belt before extending it to Sonny. Bear with it a little more, child. We will stop for the night soon. For now, here, drink some water. Being called a child struck close to home for Sonny. He was 18, but due to his thin body and small stature, both caused by malnourishment, Sonny was often mistaken for someone younger. Usually, he didn't hesitate to use it to his advantage. But for now, for some reason, being called a child irked him. Still, he was thirsty. He was about to take the flask when a whip cracked in the air, and suddenly Sonny was in a world of pain. He stumbled, once again pulling on the chain and causing the shifty slave behind him to curse. Another soldier, this one older and angrier, stopped his horse a few steps back. The whip that sliced the back of Sonny's tunic open and drew blood belonged to him. Without even glancing at the slaves, the older soldier pierced his younger colleague with a disdainful glare.
What do you think you're doing?
The young soldier's face darkened. I was just giving this boy some water. The older soldier glowered.
He'll receive water with the rest of them once we camp.
The pretty one attempted to argue, but his fellow soldier wasn't willing to listen.
Shut your mouth. These slaves are not your friends. Understood? They're not even people. Treat them like people and they'll begin imagining things.
The young soldier looked at Sonny, then lowered his head and put the flask back on his belt. His companion nodded.
Don't let me catch you making friends with the slaves again, newbie. Or next time it will be your back tasting my whip.
As if to illustrate his intention, the older soldier cracked his whip in the air and rode past them, radiating threat and anger. Sonny watched him go with well-concealed malice. I don't know how, but I will watch you die first. Then he turned his head and glanced in the direction of the younger soldier, who was falling behind with his head still lowered. And you second. The entire interaction awakened something in Sonny. He'd been so distraught by the hand he was dealt. He felt defeated, ready to give up. But this anger stoked his drive to survive. He wouldn't be treated this way, counted out. He was going to survive and become awakened. He was going to turn his curse into a blessing and for once in his goddamn life, have power. Sonny smirked as the pieces of a plan began to form in his mind. His interaction with the soldier left Sonny in a dark mood, but he pulled himself out of it and inhaled deeply, trying to enjoy the fresh air. Indeed, air like that was hard to come by in the real world. Microdust and other pollutants made it rough and unpleasant, not to mention the general stench of the outskirts. In the better parts of the city, sophisticated filtration systems worked diligently. However, filtered air tasted sterile and stagnant. Only the very rich had access to truly pleasant breathing. And here he was, able to enjoy an unlimited amount of pristine, delicious air, like a second-generation elite. At least I've gotten to breathe real air before I die. However, these real-world luxuries were laughably overshadowed by the fact that he was stuck in a chain gang. The cold was dreadful, and his wrists and feet throbbed in agony. The slave caravan slowly dragged itself up the mountain, with more and more slaves stumbling and periodically falling to the ground. A couple of times, those who could not walk anymore were taken off the chain and unceremoniously tossed off the side of the mountain, down into the abyss that loomed to the left of it. Every time it happened, Sonny was powerless to do anything but stand by and watch, his heart a mix of fear and compassion. Poor fellows. Rest in peace, you pitiful souls. Sonny remembered what the older police officer had told him about the humans here. They weren't real. Keeping that in mind, Sonny forced himself to push their suffering out of his mind and focus on preserving his own life. It was a bit strange trying to find things to be happy about in the midst of this disaster of a nightmare. But thankfully, Sonny had time to prepare himself for this eventuality. When the symptoms of the spell first appeared, he did not handle it well. Dying before you even turned 17 was not something one could easily cope with. But in the end, Sonny was surprised how quickly he came to terms with it. He visited his parents' makeshift resting place. Because Sonny was too poor to afford even the cheapest slot in the remembrance facility, their grave marker was just 2 lines carved into an old tree. He added a 3rd line for himself and found a surprising relief in the process. His life had already been full of such relentless suffering that the nightmare spell almost felt like an escape hatch. After all, he didn't have to worry about earning money, finding food, protecting himself, and planning for the future anymore. Once the worst that could happen had already happened, what else was there to fear? He had surrendered to fate and resolved to savor whatever minute joys presented himself. Besides, he knew that cold would not kill him, simply because he had already seen what was awaiting the caravan further up the mountain. The picture of piled bones littering the ground was still fresh in his mind. Most likely, a pack of monsters that were going to do the caravan in, and by the look of it, the attack was going to take place in a matter of hours, not days. The nightmare spell hadn't given him any resources, but the insight it provided could be good for something. The foreknowledge was his only hope of escaping this grisly fate, so he had to use it wisely. Sonny decided to take another look at his status and summoned the runes again. The last time, he was too outraged by the aspect and didn't study the attributes well. While not as important as one's aspect, the attributes were often the deciding factor between life and death. They represented one's natural traits and affinities, sometimes even providing passive abilities and effects. The runes read, Fated. Attribute description. The strings of fate wrap tightly around you. Unlikely events, both good and bad, are drawn by your presence. There are those who are blessed, and there are those who are cursed, but rarely both. Mark of divinity. Attribute description. You bear a faint scent of divinity, as though someone briefly touched by it once, a long time ago. Child of shadows. Attribute description. Shadows recognize you as one of their own. Sonny didn't know what to make of the unusual collection of attributes. Interesting. He recognized the first attribute, fated, as the main culprit of his predicament. At first glance, it seemed to indicate that he was destined for a certain fate. To die miserably and vanish without trace, for example. But after reading the description, he realized that being fated actually just meant that improbable things had a higher chance of occurring when he was around. I guess I have fated to thank for being stuck with unuseful aspects. Getting the weirdest, most useless aspect definitely counts as improbable. Sunny reasoned that his other two aspects, Mark of Divinity and Child of Shadows, must be linked to his role as a temple slave. Mark of Divinity theoretically came with some solid perks. It could be used to enhance several types of sorcery and allow access to certain sacred places inside the Dream Realm. Unfortunately, there were no sacred places in sight, and Sunny's aspect had nothing to do with sorcery, so it was useless too. Sunny's third aspect perplexed him. He had never heard of Child of Shadows before, and the attribute description didn't give much indication of any practical effects it might have. Soon, the sun began to dip behind the mountain, and the sky began to darken. To his surprise, Sunny found himself able to see perfectly in the darkness. This had to be related to his Child of the Shadows attribute. This ability didn't provide any immediate hints toward escaping, but it was nothing to scoff at. Maybe the shadows would reward him with some other yet unknown gifts. Finally, something good. I wonder if I can... The leader soldier's voice boomed.
Stop the caravan. Prepare to camp.
Following the head soldier's order, the slaves stopped and fell to the ground, shivering and exhausted. The small clearing where the road widened was somewhat protected from the wind by a protruding mass of rock, but it was still too cold to rest with ease. The soldiers got busy, herding the slaves into a tight circle, forcing them to share warmth, and lighting up a large bonfire in the center of the camp, although not before tending to their horses. The heavy wagon to which the main chain was firmly affixed was pushed forward to block the wind. While looking around, Sunny noticed the young soldier from before, watching the mountain with a complicated look on his face. Sunny rolled his eyes. What a weirdo. Soon, the bonfire was blazing. The stronger slaves tried to find their way closer to the fire, while the weaker ones, like Sunny, were forced to sit at the outer end of the circle, with their backs freezing in the cold. Of course, any movement was encumbered by the fact that they were still shackled to the chain. That's why the familiar broad-shouldered slave ended up just where he started, despite all of his efforts to get closer to the flame.
Damn Imperials.
He hissed, clearly irritated. The soldiers walked among the slaves, portioning out water and food. Sunny, just like everybody else, received a few sips of icy water and a small piece of rock-hard moldy bread. Despite its unappetizing look, he forced himself to eat the whole thing, just to be left as hungry as he was before. By the looks of it, he wasn't the only one. The shifty slave that had been walking behind him looked around in anguish. By all the gods, they used to feed me better even in the dungeons. He spat on the ground, desperate. And most of us innocent men in the dungeon were there waiting to visit the gallows, too. A few steps away from them, where the paved road ended and sharp rocks began, a scattering of bright red berries were growing from the snow. Sunny had noticed them before, clustering here and there along the road, and even noted how pretty those resilient things looked, contrasted against the white. The shifty slave's eyes glistened as he tried to crawl toward the berries on all fours. I would advise against eating those, friend. It was the gentle-voiced slave again. Sunny turned around and finally saw him in the flesh. He was a tall man in his 40s, lean and scraggly, handsome, with a dignified look of a scholar. How a man such as him ended up a slave was a mystery, yet there he was. The shifty slave scowled. You always have something to say, don't you? Why should I listen to you? The scholar smiled apologetically. Those berries are called bloodbane. They grow in the places where human blood was spilled. That's why there's always a lot of them along the slave trade routes. The shifty slave rolled his eyes. So what? The older man sighed. Bloodbane is poisonous. A few berries might be enough to kill an adult man. The shifty slave flinched back and glared at the scholar.
Curses!
The slave's dispute was lost on Sonny, who had an uneasy feeling in his stomach. As he looked around the camp, he recognized the markings on the mountain walls. This is where he had seen the visions of slaughtered corpses when he first started the nightmare. His stomach turned. As he closed his eyes, he could still see the mounds of cracked and shattered bones peeking out through the snow. He felt a chill run through his bones. This was where they were going to die. Sonny spun around in a panic, anxious to see if he could see some sort of nightmare creature waiting to devour them all. His chains rattled and pulled taut. He realized even if he saw the monster coming, he would be powerless to fight or flee. He was a sitting duck. As if on cue, there was a thunderous roar from above them in the mountains. The soldiers and other slaves stirred, realizing for the first time they were in grave danger. But it was too late. A massive dark form came crashing from the sky. Sonny yanked at his chains, trying to weasel away, but the being was falling at them way too fast. Panic descended over the encampment as the slaves reacted to the thunderous noise. As they turned to face it, they watched waves of boulders and heavy shards of ice raining down upon them. Fight or flight responses kicked in, and they lurched away, only to find they were anchored in place by their chains. Screams of terror rose as slaves entangled by the thick chains crashed into each other and fell to the ground. Shadows happily danced on black stones, and Sonny was one of the few slaves to remain upright. Unlike the rest of the poor slaves, he'd been able to prepare. Calm and collected, he gazed at the night sky, his attribute-enhanced eyes piercing the darkness, and took one measured step back. In the next second, a piece of ice the size of a man's torso hit the ground right in front of him and exploded, showering everything around with sharp shards. Others weren't that quick. As ice and stones continued to rain, many were wounded, and a few even lost their lives. Agonizing wails filled the air. The veteran soldier, the one who had whipped Sonny only a few hours before, stood amid the chaos.
On your feet, fools! Get to the wall!
He angrily tried to get the slaves to move toward the relative safety of the mountain slope. However, before anyone could heed his command, something massive came crashing down, sending a tremor through the stones beneath their feet. It fell right between the caravan and the mountain wall, plunging everything into silence for a few seconds. At first, it looked like a lump of dirty snow, roughly round, and as tall as a mounted horseman. However, once the creature unfurled its long limbs and rose, it towered over the stone platform like a nightmarish omen of death. Sonny's eyes went wide. That thing must be at least 4 meters tall. The creature had 2 stumpy legs, an emaciated, hunched torso, and disproportionately long, multi-jointed hands, 2 of them, each ending with a set of horrifying bone claws, and another 2, these shorter, ending with almost human-like fingers. The thing that at first glance looked like dirty snow turned out to be its fur, yellowish gray and ragged, thick enough to stop arrows and swords. On its head, 5 milky white eyes regarded the slaves with insect-like indifference. Beneath them, a terrible maw crowded with razor-sharp teeth was half open, as though in anticipation. Viscous drool was running down the creature's chin and dripping into the snow. What unnerved Sonny the most, though, were the strange shapes endlessly moving, worm-like, under the creature's skin. He could see them clearly because, unfortunately, he was one of those unlucky souls closest to the monstrosity, getting a nauseating first-row view. "What the hell is that?" he thought, stupefied. As soon as Sonny finished that thought, all hell broke loose. The creature moved, slashing its claws in his general direction. But Sonny was one step ahead. Without wasting a single moment, he jumped sideways, as far as the chain allowed, conveniently placing the broad-shouldered slave between himself and the monster. His quick reaction saved his life, as those sharp claws, each as long as a sword, sliced through the broad-shouldered man a fraction of a second later, and sent streams of blood flying through the air. Drenched in the hot liquid, Sonny hit the ground, and his fellow slave, now simply a corpse, fell on him from above. Pinned to the ground, Sonny struggled to get up.
Damn! Why are you so heavy?
Temporarily blinded, Sonny heard a chilling howl and felt an enormous shadow passing over him. Immediately after, a deafening chorus of screams filled the night. Not paying it any attention, he tried to roll the corpse to the side, but was stopped by a forceful lurch of the chain that twisted his wrists and filled his mind with white-hot pain. Disoriented, he felt himself being dragged a few steps, but then the chain suddenly slackened, and he was able to control his hands again. Thank God for small favors. Putting his palms against the dead man's chest, he pushed with all the strength he had. The heavy corpse stubbornly resisted his attempts, but then finally fell sideways, setting Sonny free. However, he didn't get to celebrate his newly found freedom, as his blood suddenly turned to ice. At that moment, with his palms still pressed against the broad-shouldered slave's bleeding body, he felt something wriggling under the dead man's skin. He chastised himself for thinking he was somehow even minorly victorious. Pushing the corpse with his legs, Sonny crawled as far away from it as he could, which was about 1.5 meters thanks to the ever-present chain. He quickly glanced around, noticing a mass of dancing shadows and the silhouette of the monster rampaging amidst the screaming slaves on the opposite end of the stone platform. Then he concentrated on the dead body, which was starting to convulse with growing violence. On the opposite side of the corpse, the shifty slave was staring with a slackened jaw and a horrified expression on his face. Sonny waved to get his attention.
What are you staring at? Move away from it!
The shifty slave tried, but immediately fell. The chain was twisted between the three of them, pinned down by the broad-shouldered man's weight. Sonny clenched his teeth. Right under his eyes, the corpse was going through a nightmare-inducing metamorphosis. Strange bone growths pierced its skin, extending like spikes. The muscles bulged and wriggled as though trying to change shape. The fingernails were turning into sharp claws. The face cracked and split, bearing open a twisted mouth with one too many rows of bloodied, needle-like fangs. Sonny swallowed a lump in his throat. That's not good. He twitched, feeling a strong urge to empty his stomach. The scholarly slave was just a few steps behind the shifty one, pointing at his shackles with a face as pale as a ghost.
The chain is going to get us all killed.
That remark was far from helpful, but given the circumstances, his shock was understandable. Being shackled was bad enough, but being shackled to such a horror was truly unfair. This whole situation felt off to Sonny, not just because of the dramatics, but because it didn't fit with all he knew about the nightmare spell. The spell, mysterious as it was, had its own set of rules. There were rules for what type of creatures could appear in any given nightmare, too. Nightmare creatures had their hierarchy. It went beasts, monsters, demons, devils, tyrants, terrors, and titans. There was an extremely rare caste above that, known as calamities. The first nightmare was a trial for beginners, and as such, was supposed to be populated by beasts and monsters. In rare instances, one may come face to face with a demon, but that was it. The creature that was hunting them had to be far beyond that level. Nightmare creatures' powers increased with their level, and the skill this animal had just shown, the ability to create a lesser version of itself, was something that was only seen in tyrants and above. What was this tyrant even doing in a first nightmare? Was it because of Sunny's damned fated attribute? How many more times would this screw him over? But there was no time to ponder. Unfair or not, there was only one person now who could save Sunny. Himself. The broad-shouldered man, what was left of him, slowly rose, his mouth producing strange clicking noises. Without giving him time to fully come to his senses, Sunny cursed and jumped forward, grabbing onto the length of the slackened chain. One arm of the monster, now fully equipped with 5 jagged claws, shot forward to meet him, but Sunny sidestepped it with one calculated movement. What saved his skin this time was not a quick reaction, but a simple presence of mind. Sunny never trained in any fancy combat techniques, since his childhood was spent on the streets. But the streets, too, were a kind of teacher. He had spent his whole life fighting for survival, quite often literally. That experience allowed him to keep a cool head on his shoulders in the midst of any conflict. So instead of freezing or being consumed by fear and doubt, Sunny just acted. Stepping close, he threw the chain around the monster's shoulders and pulled, pinning his hands to its body. Before the creature, still slow and groggy from its transformation, could properly react, Sunny wrapped the chain around it several times, barely saving his face from being bitten off by the creature's terrifying maw. The good thing was, the monster couldn't move its hands now. The bad thing was, the length of the chain he used to immobilize it was gone, leaving almost no distance between them.
You two!
Sunny screamed at the shifty and scholarly slaves.
Pull on that chain as though your lives depend on it!
The shifty slave and the scholar gaped at him, and then, understanding what he was thinking, started to move. Grabbing the chain from the opposite directions, they pulled as hard as they could, tightening their grip on the monster and not letting it shake loose. Sunny sighed in relief.
Well done!
The monster bulged its muscles trying to break free. The chain creaked, caught on the bone spikes as though slowly breaking apart. The scholar frowned. Not well enough. Without wasting any more time, Sunny threw his hands in the air and caught the creature's neck with the short, thinner chain connecting his shackles. Then, he circled the monster with a quick step and pulled, ending up back to back with it, as far away from its maw as he could. Sunny knew that he wasn't strong enough to strangle a man with his bare hands, let alone a weird, terrifying mutant like the one trying to eat him. But now, using his own back as a lever, and the weight of his whole body to pull the shackles down, he at least stood a chance. He pulled down with all his might, feeling the monster's body pressing against him, bone spikes brushing against his skin. The monster continued to struggle, clicking loudly and trying to break the chain tying him down apart. Now it was just a question of what would break first, the chain or the monster itself.
Die! Die, you bastard!
Sweat and blood were rolling down Sunny's face as he was pulling and pulling down with as much force as he could muster. Every second felt like an eternity. His strength and stamina, what little he had to begin with, were quickly running out. His wounded back, wrists, and muscles, pierced by the bone spikes, were in agony. And then, finally, Sunny felt the monster's body go limp. A moment later, a faintly familiar voice rang in the air. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard.
You have slain a dormant beast, Mountain King's larva.
Sunny released the dead beast and sank back to catch his breath. He'd done it. He'd fucking killed that creature's spawn. Shifty sneered at Sunny.
Don't just lay there, you idiot! The big one is still out there!
Another thunderous roar echoed in the canyon, and Sunny forced himself to his feet. There was still plenty of battle to be fought, and that monster wasn't going to care that Sunny wasn't up to it. It took all his strength to dispatch with the larva. How was he going to stand a chance against the big one?
You have slain a dormant beast, the Mountain King's larva.
Sunny fell breathlessly to his knees. His whole body felt as though it just went through a meat grinder. Even large amounts of adrenaline could not wash away all the pain and exhaustion. And yet, he was exhilarated. The satisfaction of killing the larva was so vast that he even forgot to be disappointed about not receiving a memory, the special item tied to a Dream Realm inhabitant's essence, which was sometimes awarded by the spell to the triumphant awakened. A magic sword or a suit of armor would have come in handy right about now. He would even settle for a warm coat.
3 seconds. You can rest for 3 more seconds,
Sonny thought. The nightmare was far from over. A few moments later, he forced himself to come back to his senses and looked around, trying to assess his situation. The larva was dead, which was great. However, he was still tied to it by the damned chain. The shifty slave and the scholar, both pale as death, were busy untangling it to buy the 3 of them at least some freedom of movement. Further away, torn bodies and pieces of flesh were lying on the ground. Many slaves were killed. The lucky few who had somehow managed to escape were now running away.
Fools. They're dooming themselves.
The chain jerked towards where they ran, but then suddenly went slack. A burst of hope filled Sonny's chest, but it was quickly dashed when he realized he was still attached to the scholar and the shifty slave. At some point, the chain must have broken in 2. If their shackles had a less sophisticated locking mechanism, he would have tried to pick the lock and free himself. Unfortunately, each pair was fixed to a specific link. Without unlocking them, no one was going anywhere. The tyrant, Mountain King, was hidden from sight by the bright glow of the bonfire. Sonny could feel his movements, however, due to the subtle tremors spreading through the stones. Screams of the slaves who were yet to perish filled the night. The soldiers, who were still alive, bellowed out, desperately trying to fight off the monstrosity. What pulled Sonny's attention the most, however, was the fact that several of the maimed bodies were starting to move.
More larvae?
His eyes widened. One after another, 4 more corpses slowly rose to their feet. Each beast looked as disgusting as the first had, and not a bit less deadly. The nearest was mere feet away from Sonny.
Damn it all!
He thought. Then, weakly,
I want to wake up.
a strange clicking filled the air. One of the beasts turned its head towards Sonny's group of slaves and gnashed its fangs. The shifty slave fell on his ass, whispering a prayer, while the scholar just froze in place. Sonny's eyes darted to the ground, trying to find something to use as a weapon, but there was nothing there. But he wasn't about to give up. Full of vitriol, he simply wrapped a length of chain around his knuckles and raised his fists.
Come at me, you bastard!
The larva dashed forward with incredible speed, in a flurry of claws, fangs, and terror. Sonny had less than a second to react. Before he could do anything, a nimble figure moved past him, and a sharp sword flashed in the air. The monster, beheaded with one strike, fell gracelessly to the ground. Sonny blinked.
What was that?
Dumbfounded, he slowly turned his head and looked to his left. Standing there, with a valorous expression, was the handsome young soldier who had offered him water. He looked calm and collected, if a little grim. There was not a speck of dirt or blood on his leather armor.
That was incredible.
Sonny thought before catching himself.
I mean, that was all right, I guess.
With a short nod, the soldier moved forward to face the remaining 3 larvae. But after taking a few steps, he suddenly turned around and gave Sonny a long look. Then, with one swift motion, the young warrior took something from his belt and threw it to Sonny.
Save yourself.
With that, he was gone to fight the monsters. Sonny reflexively caught the item and watched the soldier go. Then he lowered his gaze and studied the thing clutched tightly in his hand. It was a short and narrow iron rod with a straight bend on its end.
Is it a key?
His heart began to beat faster.
It's the key to the shackles. It has to be.
With one last glance at the fierce battle starting between the young soldier and the larvae, Sonny dropped to one knee and began twisting his shackles, maneuvering them into a position he could work with. It took him a few tries to understand how the unfamiliar lock worked, but then, finally, there was a satisfying click, and he was suddenly free. The cold wind caressed his bloodied wrists. Sonny rubbed them and smiled with a dark gleam in his eyes. For a moment, visions of violence and revenge filled his head.
Boy, over here!
The shifty slave was waving his hands in the air, trying to get his attention. Sonny briefly considered leaving him to die, but then decided against it. There was strength in numbers. He hurried over to the other two slaves and quickly unlocked their shackles. As soon as the shifty slave was free, he pushed Sonny away and did a little dance, laughing like a maniac.
Ha! Free at last! Gods must be smiling upon us.
The scholar was more reserved. He squeezed Sonny's shoulder in gratitude and smiled weakly, casting a tense look in the direction of the ensuing fight. 2 of the 3 larvae were already dead. The third one was missing an arm, but still trying to tear its opponent apart. The young soldier danced around it, moving with the grace of a natural-born warrior.
What are you waiting for? Run!
The shifty slave made a move to run away, but was stopped by the scholar. Benny, my friend, I would...
If you say advise again, Fraser, I swear to the gods I will bash your head open.
The 2 slaves looked at each other with open animosity. A moment later, Fraser lowered his eyes and sighed. If we run away now, we will surely die.
Why?
The older slave simply pointed at the tall bonfire. Because without that fire, we will freeze to death before the night is over. Until the sun rises, running away is suicide. Sonny did not say anything, knowing that Fraser was right. He realized it right after strangling the larva. No matter how terrible Mountain King was, the bonfire was still their only lifeline in this frozen hell. It was as what the broad-shouldered slave, may he rest in peace, had said. There was no need for anyone to kill them. The mountain itself would do it.
So what? I would rather freeze to death than be eaten by that monster. Or, turn into one of those things.
Benny was pretending to be brave, but there was no conviction in his voice. He glanced at the darkness surrounding the stone platform and shivered before taking a small step back. At this point, the third larva was long dead, and the young soldier was nowhere to be seen. He had probably gone to join the fight at the other side of the bonfire, leaving the 3 slaves alone at the mountainside part of the stone platform. The monster might be sated with those it had already slain. It might be defeated or driven away by the Imperials. If we stay here, we have a chance to survive, however small. But if we run away, our doom will be certain.
So what do we do?
Unlike Fraser, Sonny was sure that the Mountain King would not be satisfied until all of the trespassers to its lands were dead. What chance did a bunch of mortals have to defeat such a tyrant? Even if they were not normal people but awakened, a fight with a tyrant was not something one could easily survive, let alone win. But if they wanted to live, they had to get rid of that thing somehow.
Let's go take a look.
Benny looked at him as though seeing a lunatic.
Are you insane? You want to get closer to that beast?
As if on cue, the great beast roared in the distance. Sonny shrugged.
We have to do something. I'd rather die fighting. Come on.
Sonny turned and strode off toward the rampaging monster. Sonny was off to face a nightmare creature. And not any creature, but one of the highest categories of terrifying creatures that existed within the nightmare realm. A dreaded, fearsome tyrant. The odds of survival were so low that anyone would have laughed in his face if he were to ever suggest attempting to fight it. Only an awakened that was at least 2 or 3 ranks above the creature would have stood a chance. Sonny certainly wasn't one of those. And yet, he had to deal with this Mountain King somehow to avoid an even more miserable death. The ridiculous degree to which the odds were stacked against him from the very beginning of this delayed execution had gotten old a long time ago. He didn't have the energy to even bother thinking about it. What was there to fear anyway? He was already as good as dead, so why worry about it? On the other side of the bonfire, things were turning from bad to worse. Most of the slaves were already dead. A few soldiers were still desperately trying to fight the monster, but it was clear that they weren't going to last long. Right in front of Sonny's eyes, the tyrant picked up a dead slave, dragging the chain up with him, and opened its terrifying maw wide. With one crushing bite, the slave's body was torn in half, leaving only bloodied stumps inside the shackles. The Mountain King's 5 indifferent milky eyes stared into the distance as it chewed, streams of blood flowing down its chin. Seeing that the creature's upper arms were busy, one of the soldiers screamed and lunged forward, brandishing his long spear. Without turning its head, the tyrant extended one of its shorter lower arms, catching the soldier's head in an iron grip. It squeezed, crushing the poor man's skull like a grape. A moment later, the headless body was tossed over the cliff, disappearing into the abyss below. Benny doubled over, vomiting violently into the snow. Then he shakily rose to his feet and glared at Sonny.
Well, we've had a look. Now what?
Sonny did not answer, pensively observing the tyrant with his head slightly tilted to one side. Benny turned to Fraser.
I'm telling you, old man, the boy is sick in the head. How the hell can he be so calm?
Shh! Lower your voice, fool.
Blood drained from Benny's face as he clapped his hands over his mouth. Then he cast a fearful look in the direction of the tyrant. Luckily, the abomination was too busy feasting on the slaves, the lucky ones who were already dead, and the unlucky ones who were still alive, to pay them any attention. Benny slowly exhaled. Sonny was preoccupied with thinking, measuring his chances of survival. How do I get rid of that thing? He didn't have any special powers, nor did he have an army ready to bury the tyrant under a mountain of bodies. He didn't even have a weapon to at least scratch the damn bastard. Sonny moved his gaze and looked past the creature, into the endless darkness of the moonless sky. Suddenly, a bright flash streaked in the air and collided with one of the tyrant's arms. The collision burst and sparks rained down onto the mountainside. The young soldier, Sonny's heroic liberator, had just tossed a burning piece of wood at the monster and was now defiantly raising his sword.
Face me, devil!
A distraction. Perfect. Sonny knew there was no way he could kill the Mountain King with his own 2 hands. He decided to enlist some help. A human wouldn't be up to the task, but a force of nature on the other hand. Since I can't do the bastard in myself, let's make gravity do it for me. He was in the middle of thinking over the details of the plan when the young hero's foolish bravado presented an opportunity. Now, everything depended on how long the pompous idiot would manage to stay alive.
Come with me,
Sonny said as he started running toward the far end of the stone platform, where the heavy wagon was perched dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. Benny and Fraser shared a hesitating look, but followed him anyway. Benny muttered under his breath,
Is this calm confidence or madness?
Fraser shook his head. Who knows, but it is often the mad who are favored by the gods. Behind them, the young heroic soldier nimbly ducked under the tyrant's claws, slashing it with his sword. The sharp edge slid ineffectively across the dirty fur, not leaving even a scratch on the creature's flesh. In a flash, the tyrant moved with frightening speed, throwing all four of its hands in the direction of its new, irritating foe. Meanwhile, Sonny ran with all his speed towards the wagon. Once he reached it, he hurriedly looked around, checking if there were any larvae close by. Once he was sure he was in the clear, he pushed the wagon, trying to move its rear wheels. The wagon was left at the upper end of the stone platform, where it narrowed and turned back into the road. It was turned sideways to block the wind, with its front facing the mountain wall and its back facing the cliff. There were two large wooden wedges placed under the rear wheels to prevent the wagon from rolling backward. Sonny turned to his companions and pointed at the wedges.
When I tell you, remove both of them, then push. Understand? What? Why?
Benny stared at him with a dumbfounded expression on his face. Fraser just looked at the wedges and then at the tyrant. The young soldier was miraculously still alive. He was weaving between the creature's limbs, always just half a second away from being completely eviscerated. From time to time, his sword flashed in the air, but to no avail. The Mountain King's fur was too thick, and his skin too tough to be harmed by mundane weapons. There was a hint of apprehension on the young warrior's face. All the other soldiers, as far as Sonny could see, were already dead. Sonny needed that soldier to live a little bit longer.
Don't die yet,
he thought. To Benny, he simply said,
"Just do it. Trust me."
The next moment, Sonny was running again, trying to follow the chain from the brace where it was fixed to the wagon. The thing he was searching for was hard to notice due to all the bodies, blood, and viscera littering the stone platform. But for once, luck was on his side. A short amount of time later, he had found what he needed, the torn end of the chain. Finding the nearest set of shackles, complete with a horribly disfigured body of a slave locked in them, Sonny plopped down on his knees and scrambled to unlock them. With a sideways glance, Sonny noticed the brave young soldier flying through the air, finally caught by one of the tyrant's strikes. Incredibly, the young soldier managed to land on his feet, sliding several feet across the stones. All of his limbs were still in place. There were no terrible wounds on his body either. Without skipping a beat, the soldier rolled forward, picking up his sword from where it fell on the ground, and then rolled once more, this time sideways, narrowly avoiding a heavy stomp from the creature's foot. With a resounding click, Sonny finally managed to unlock the shackles, shaking the dead slave out of them. He promptly locked them once again, this time around the chain itself, ending up with a makeshift slipknot and loop. Now, everything depended on his resolve, hand-eye coordination, and luck. Turning to Benny and Fraser, who were still waiting by the wagon, he screamed,
"Now!"
Then, picking up a sizable length of chain, Sonny stood up and faced the tyrant. The young soldier spared him half a glance. His eyes lingered on the chain for a moment, and then quickly followed it to the wagon. Without showing a hint of emotion, the young warrior doubled his efforts, drawing the creature's attention away from Sonny. Sonny focused on the weight of the chain in his hands, the distance between him and the tyrant, and his target. Time seemed to slow.
"Please, don't miss."
Gathering all of his strength, Sonny spun and threw the chain in the air. Like a fisherman casting his net, the loop opened as it flew, closing in on the position of the fight between the young soldier and the tyrant. Sonny just needed the loop to land on the ground, close enough to them that once one of the tyrant's feet landed in the trap, he could pull on the chain and tighten it around the monster's ankle. In the last moment, the Mountain King suddenly flinched back, and instead of falling on the ground, the chain loop landed perfectly around its neck. A second later, it tightened, acting as an iron noose. Sonny froze for a moment. He couldn't believe his eyes. He clenched his jaw and balled his fists at his side. He held himself back from triumphantly shaking them in the air.
"Yes!"
He screamed inwardly. Moments later, The wagon rolled off the cliff, pulling the tyrant down with it. Sonny looked back to make sure, but what he saw drained the blood from his face. Benny and Fraser had managed to remove the wedges from under the wagon's wheels and were now desperately pushing it to the edge of the road. However, the wagon was rolling slowly, very slowly, much slower than Sonny had anticipated. He turned to the tyrant, panicking. The creature, surprised by the sudden weight pressing down on its neck, was already raising its hands to tear the chain apart. Sonny's eyes widened. In the next second, the young knight crashed into one of the tyrant's legs, throwing it off balance and buying them some more time. Sonny was already running to the wagon, cursing loudly in his mind. Reaching it, he threw all of his weight into the damp wood alongside Benny and Fraser. He pushed with all the strength left in his rather small, terribly beaten, and enormously exhausted body.
Roll! Roll, you creaky piece of shit!
The wagon sped up a little, but was still too slow. It needed more momentum to reach the cliff's edge. Sonny turned and saw something that sent a ripple of dread across his body. The tyrant had finally managed to get a hold of the chain tied around its neck, trying to free itself.
Roll, you creaky piece of shit!
Sonny pressed himself against the wagon, pushing with all he had. The 4 powerful oxen that used to pull it were now dead, and instead of them, 3 tired slaves were trying to do the job. Even with the slope of the road helping them, the speed of the wagon was agonizingly slow. The tyrant, unfortunately, was moving much faster. Pushing the young soldier back with a deadly swipe of its lower arms, the Mountain King raised its lower arms to its neck, trying to grab hold of the chained noose around its neck. The Mountain King's fearsome physique seemed to be turning into a disadvantage. Its long, terrifying bone claws were perfect for tearing flesh apart, but they weren't the best tool for precise movements. It took the tyrant some time to finally get a hold of the chain without slicing its neck open. Right as the beast got a grip on the chain, the wagon finally started to approach the edge of the cliff.
Come on, just a little bit more!
The wagon's rear wheels finally slid from the road, hanging over the dark, seemingly bottomless pit beneath. The creature felt a tug on the chain and turned, staring expressionlessly at the 3 slaves with its 5 milky, dead eyes. The wagon tipped, half of the wood disappearing towards the abyss below. The quick motion threw Benny and Fraser off their feet. Then, the wagon froze, balanced precariously on its middle axis. Sonny was the only one left standing. He cast a last glance at the towering monster, and then slammed his shoulder into the front of the wagon. The wagon finally lost its balance and rolled over the edge, scraping its undersides deafeningly against the jagged rocks. Sonny fell forward, landing on his knees, narrowly saving himself from tumbling down the cliff with it. Turning his head to the tyrant, he gave it a wicked smile. The Mountain King made a move to lunge at the scrawny slave, but it was already too late. A moment later, the chain on his neck drew tight, and he was yanked back with tremendous force, flying over the edge of the cliff like a rag doll. The creature fell into the darkness silently, as though refusing to believe that it had been defeated by a tiny human.
Die, you giant bastard,
Sonny thought. Then he took one deep, ragged breath and dropped to the ground, utterly exhausted.
Is this it? Did I pass the trial?
He rested on the cold stones, staring at the night sky, and waited for that faintly familiar but elusive voice to announce his victory. But instead, wave after wave of pain that he had earlier chosen to ignore finally started to catch up with his abused body. His whole body ached. His joints flared with pain. The skin on his back slashed by a slaver's whip and pierced by the bone spikes of a newborn larva, burned in agony. He started to shiver, once again consumed by the dreadful cold. I guess not. His thoughts were slow and muddy. What else am I supposed to do? A dark figure appeared above him. It was the young soldier. He looked as calm and handsome as ever. Dirt and scratches decorated his armor from his valiant battle, but otherwise, the young soldier appeared to be fine. He extended one arm to Sonny.
You can't rest here. You'll freeze to death.
Sonny sighed, accepting that his first nightmare was not over. Then he clenched his teeth and slowly rose to his feet, ignoring the soldier's helping hand. Around them, there was a sense of utter carnage. Except for the 3 slaves and the heroic soldier, every member of the caravan was dead. Their bodies littered the ground. They were horribly maimed, and some were torn into pieces. Here and there, a repulsive carcass of a larva could be seen. Shadows cast by the bonfire danced happily across the stone platform, seemingly unperturbed by this morbid view. Sonny was already numb to the gruesome carnage, or was simply too tired to react. Benny and Fraser were already up, looking at the soldier with weary apprehension. With or without shackles, they were still slaves, and he was still a slave driver. Noticing their tense gazes, the soldier sighed.
Come closer to the fire, all of you. We need to warm ourselves and discuss what to do next.
Without waiting for their response, the soldier turned around and walked away. After hesitating for a few moments, the slaves followed. A bit of time later, the 4 of them were seated around the bonfire, soaking up pleasant heat. Benny and Fraser were close to each other, maintaining a safe distance from the soldier. Sonny sat apart from everyone, not because he had a specific reason to distrust one more than the others, but simply because he didn't know how to interact with people in general. Growing up, Sonny was always a misfit. It's not that he had never tried to become close with someone. It's just that he seemed to lack the ability. It was as if there was an invisible wall between him and the rest of the world. If he had to put it in words, Sonny would say that he was born without a small but important gear in his brain that everyone else seemed to possess. As a result, he was often baffled and stumped by human behavior, and his attempts to imitate it, however diligent, inevitably fell flat. This strangeness made others uncomfortable. He has always been a bit different, and if there was one thing people hated, it was those different from them. Over time, Sonny simply learned to avoid getting too close to anyone and settled comfortably into his outcast role. This habit served him well, since it not only made him self-reliant, but also saved him from being stabbed in the back by shady characters on multiple occasions. That's why he was not thrilled to share the rest of this nightmare with 3 strangers. Instead of trying to start a conversation, Sonny sat quietly by himself, lost in thoughts. After a few minutes, the soldier's voice finally broke the silence.
My name's Gregor.
Sonny looked up and across the fire at him. Benny scoffed. Oh, so we're on a first-name basis now. Or were you planning to still just refer to us as slaves? Gregor ignored Benny's words.
Once the sun rises, we will gather whatever food and water we can find and go back down the mountain.
Benny gave him a defiant look. Why should we go back? To be put in chains again? The young soldier sighed.
We can go our separate ways once we leave the mountain. But until then, I'm still responsible for your lives. We can't continue up the road since the way over the mountain pass is long and arduous. Without the supplies that were stored on the wagon, your chances of making it are not high. That's why going back is our best hope.
Fraser opened his mouth, planning to say something, but then thought better of it and remained silent. Benny cursed, but was seemingly convinced by Gregor's rational words.
We can't go down.
Benny barked a laugh and glanced at the soldier.
Don't listen to him, your lordship. This boy is, touched by the gods. He's crazy, is what I'm trying to say.
Gregor frowned, looking at the slaves. The two of you are only alive thanks to this child's bravery. Aren't you ashamed to badmouth him so? Benny shrugged, showing that he wasn't ashamed in the least. The young soldier shook his head. I, for one, would like to hear his reasoning. Tell me, why can't we go down? Sonny shifted, uncomfortable in the center of everyone's attention.
Because the monster isn't dead. Because the monster isn't dead.
These ominous words hung in the silence. 3 pairs of eyes widened, staring right at Sonny. Why do you say that? After thinking about it, Sonny came to the conclusion that the tyrant was indeed still alive. His reasoning was pretty straightforward. He did not hear the spell congratulating him on slaying the creature after it fell off the cliff, which meant that it was not slain. But he couldn't explain that to his companions. He pointed up.
The monster jumped from an incredible height to land on this platform. Yet it wasn't harmed at all. Why would it be killed by falling off the cliff?
Neither Gregor nor the slaves could find a flaw in this argument. Sonny continued.
Which means that it's still alive, somewhere down the mountain. So by going back, we will be delivering ourselves into its maw.
Benny cursed loudly and crawled closer to the bonfire, staring into the darkness with terror in his eyes. Fraser rubbed his temples, mumbling, Of course. Why didn't I realize myself? Gregor was the most stoic of the 3. After thinking it over, he nodded. Then we go up and over the mountain pass. But that's not all. He glanced in the direction where the tyrant had fallen. If the monster is still alive, there is a high possibility that it will return here and then pursue us, which means that time is of the essence. We will need to move as soon as the sun rises. He gestured to the torn bodies littering the platform. We can't allow ourselves to rest the whole night anymore. We need to gather supplies now. If there was a chance, I would have liked to give these people at least a humble burial after gathering all that we can from them. But alas, fate has decided otherwise. Gregor rose to his feet and brandished a sharp knife. Benny tensed up and watched the blade carefully, but then relaxed, seeing that the young soldier showed no sign of aggression. Food, water, warm clothes, firewood. That is what we need to find. Let us split up and accomplish one task each. He then pointed at himself with the tip of the knife. I will carve the oxen carcasses to get us some meat. Fraser looked around the stone platform, most of it drowning in deep shadows, and grimaced. I'll look for firewood. Benny also glanced left and right with a strange gleam in his eyes.
Then I'll go find us something warm to wear.
Sonny was the last one left. Gregor gave him a long look. Most of our water was stored on the wagon, but each of my fallen brothers was carrying a flagon. Gather as many as you can find. Sometime later, far enough from the bonfire to be hidden in the shadows, Sonny looked for dead soldiers, with 6 flagons already weighing him down. Shivering in the cold, he finally stumbled on the last broken body clad in leather armor. A cry of pain broke through the silence of the night. The old veteran, the one who had whipped him for trying to accept Gregor's flask, was badly injured and dying, but miraculously, still clinging to life. Horrible wounds were covering his chest and stomach. His time was running out. Sonny knelt beside the dying soldier and looked him over, searching for the man's flagon. What irony, he thought. The old man chuckled, a strange, strained laugh that brought up blood with it. The older man tried to focus his eyes on Sonny,
and weakly moved his hand, reaching for something. Sonny looked down and noticed a shattered sword laying on the ground not far from them. Curious, he picked it up. "Are you looking for this?" The dying soldier didn't answer, watching the young slave with some unknown intense emotion in his eyes. Sonny sighed. "It's the least I can do." With that, he leaned forward and slit the old man's throat with the sharp edge of his broken blade, then threw it away. The soldier twitched, drowning in his own blood. The expression in his eyes changed. Was it gratitude or hatred? Sonny did not know. Illusion or not, it was his first time killing a human. Sonny expected to feel guilt or fear, but actually there was nothing at all. It seemed that, for better or worse, his cruel upbringing in the real world had prepared him for this moment well. He sat quietly near the old man, keeping him company on his last journey. After a while, the spell's voice came whispering into his ear.
You have slain a dormant human, name unknown.
Sonny flinched. "Oh, right. Killing people is also an achievement as far as the spell is concerned. They don't usually show this in the webtoons and dramas." He registered that fact and put it away, but as it turned out, the spell wasn't done speaking.
You have received a memory.
Sonny froze, opening his eyes wide. "I hope it's something useful." Memories could be anything, from weapons to enchanted items. One received from a dormant rank enemy wouldn't be too powerful, but it was still a boon, weightless and undetectable, able to be summoned from nothingness with a simple thought. A memory was incredibly useful. What's more, unlike corporeal things, he would be able to bring it back with him to the real world. The advantage of having something like that back in the outskirts was hard to overestimate. A weapon, a sword, anything.
Memory received. Silver bell.
Sonny sighed, disappointed. "Well, with my luck, what was I expecting?" Still, this thing was worth investigating. Maybe it had a powerful enchantment, like being able to send out destructive sonic waves or repel incoming projectiles. Sonny summoned the runes and concentrated on the words, "Silver Bell." Immediately, an image of a small bell appeared in front of his eyes, with a short string of text below. Silver Bell, a small memento of a long-lost home, which once brought its owner comfort and joy. Its clear ringing can be heard from miles away. Shit, Sonny thought, dejected. His first memory turned out to be pretty much useless, like everything else he possessed. He was almost starting to see a theme in how the spell was treating him. Sonny dismissed the runes and then got busy removing the dead man's fur cloak and warm, sturdy leather boots. As an officer, the quality of these clothes was a notch above those of simple soldiers. After putting them on, Sonny finally felt warm for the first time since the nightmare began, not considering the short time he had spent near the bonfire. "At least I won't die from exposure now," he thought. The cloak was a bit bloodied, but then again, so was Sonny. He looked around, easily piercing the veil of darkness with his tenebrious eyes. Gregor and Fraser were still in the middle of their tasks. Benny was supposed to be looking for winter clothes, but was greedily pulling rings off the dead men's fingers instead. Unseen to them, Sonny hesitated, considering if he had really thought things through well enough. His companions were unreliable. The future was too uncertain. Even the requirements of passing the nightmare remained a mystery. Any decision he could make would have been a gamble at best. Still, he had to make some if he wanted to survive. Not wasting any more time thinking, Sonny returned to help the team scavenge with a deep sigh. They spent the rest of the night sitting with their backs against the bonfire, staring fearfully into the night. Despite the exhaustion, no one could sleep. The possibility of the tyrant coming back to finish the 4 survivors off was too frightening. Only Gregor seemed to be fine, calmly sharpening his sword in the bright light of the dancing flames. The sound of the wet stone scraping against the blade was somehow comforting. At the break of dawn, when the sun had lazily begun to warm up the air, they loaded themselves with all the supplies they'd managed to gather and set out into the cold. Sonny looked back, taking in the sight of the stone platform for the last time. He managed to get past the place where the slave caravan was supposed to perish. What other horrors were in store for him before he could finally wake up? If he ever would wake up. There was a problem. They were planning to follow the road up to the mountain pass and then over it, getting as far away from the scene of the massacre as they could before the night came. However, the road was no more. At some point during the last months, or maybe even just yesterday, a terrible rockfall occurred, obliterating whole segments of the narrow roadway and making its other parts untraversable. Sonny stood on the precipice of a vast chasm, looking down with no particular expression on his face. What do we do now? Fraser's voice was muffled by the collar of his scavenged fur cloak. Behind him, Benny angrily looked around. His gaze stopped at Sonny, a suitable victim to vent his frustration.
I'll tell you what we need to do. Get rid of some dead weight.
He eyed Sonny's fine boots and turned to Gregor.
Listen, your lordship. The boy is too weak. He is slowing us down. And he's crazy. A bit off mentally.
The young soldier answered with a judgmental frown, but Benny wasn't done.
Look how he's glaring at me. I swear to the gods, ever since he joined the caravan, nothing has gone right. Maybe Fraser was right. The boy is cursed by the shadow god.
Sonny struggled not to roll his eyes. It was true that he was unlucky. However, the whole truth was opposite to what Benny was trying to insinuate. It was not that he had attracted misfortune to the slave caravan. On the contrary, it was because the caravan was doomed to begin with that he had ended up here. Fraser furrowed his brow.
But I've never said that.
Whatever. Shouldn't we get rid of him just in case? He can't go on for much longer anyway.
Fraser gave Sonny a strange look. Perhaps Sonny was getting paranoid, but there seemed to be a bit of calculating coldness in the older slave's eyes. Finally, Fraser shook his head.
Don't be too hasty, friend. The boy might prove useful later on.
But...
Gregor finally spoke, putting an end to their quarrel.
We are not going to leave anyone behind. As for how much longer he'll be able to endure, just worry about yourself.
Benny clenched his teeth, but then just waved a hand.
Fine. So what do we do then?
The 4 of them looked at the broken road, then down the slope of the mountain, and finally up, where a sheer cliff wall was broken apart by the falling rocks. After a bit of silence, Fraser finally spoke.
In the old days, there used to be a path leading to the peak of the mountain. It was sometimes used by pilgrims. The Empire had widened parts of the path and built a proper road on top of it, now leading to the mountain pass instead of the peak, of course.
He looked up.
The remnants of the original path should still be somewhere above us. If we could reach it, we should be able to find our way back to the undamaged section of the road.
Everyone followed his gaze, shifting uncomfortably at the prospect of climbing the treacherous slope, except for Gregor, of course, who remained as calm as a saint. Due to the rockfall, the slope wasn't an almost vertical wall anymore, but still, the incline was sharp. Benny was the first one to speak.
Climb that? Are you insane?
Fraser shrugged.
Do you have a better idea?
No one did. After a bit of preparation, they began the ascent. Benny and Fraser stubbornly carried the weapons they had picked up off the dead soldiers' bodies, but Sonny, with some regret, decided to leave his newfound short sword behind. He knew that this climb was going to test the limits of their endurance. The sword might not have seemed to be that heavy right now, but every extra gram of weight was bound to feel like a ton all too soon. As the weakest member of the group, he was already struggling to keep up, so there wasn't a lot of choice. Shedding a few kilograms of iron was the right thing to do. Walking up the mountain road with the weight of the supplies on his shoulders was already hard enough, but climbing up the mountain itself turned out to be pure torture. Just half an hour later, he felt like his muscles were going to melt, his lungs on the verge of imploding. Sonny continued to move forward and up. He had to constantly remind himself to watch his footing, too. On this unstable, icy slope, one misstep was enough to send a man tumbling down to his death. Just think about something pleasant, he thought. But what happy thoughts could he summon? Failing to come up with something else, Sonny began to imagine what reward he was going to receive at the end of this trial. The boon of the first nightmare was the most important thing given to an awakened by the spell. Later trials could provide them with more abilities and vastly improve their power, but it was this first one that determined what role an awakened would be able to play. The first trial was what gave them the necessary tools to survive and grow. It would determine how great their potential would be, and what price they would have to pay to grow and survive in the dream realm. The main benefit of the first nightmare's boon was simple, yet possibly the most important. After completing their trial, aspirants were bestowed with the ability to perceive and interact with soul cores. Soul cores were the basis of one's rank and power. The stronger your core was, the greater and stronger you could become.